Hello, my name is Victor Do Prado. I am a senior fellow at the Brazilian Center of International Relations, SEBRI. I also teach economic diplomacy at Sciences Po in Paris, and I am a member of the Friends of Multilateralism group. It's my great honor and privilege today to speak to Alan Wolff. Hi, Alan. Good to see you again.
Good morning.
Alan is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. He was previously Deputy Director General, DDG, as we say, at the WTO. Alan has a long career in trade matters, including as United States Deputy Special Representative for Trade Negotiations during the Carter administration. He was chairman of the National Foreign Trade Council, just to mention two of his posts. Alan is also the author of a book called Revitalizing the World Trading System, which was listed by Martin Wolff, no relation, of the Financial Times as one of the best books in 2023 in economics, and described as the definitive guide to past, present, and future of the multilateral trading system. Alan, thank you very much for taking the time. You're also a member of our Friends of Multilateralism group. Thank you for taking the time to do this interview for our group. And our subject today is WTO reform, something that you have focused on in quite a bit of detail in your book. And I remember we talking about it during our time in Geneva. Before we jump into WTO reform, though, you were just arriving back from Abu Dhabi, where you attended MC13. Could you tell us your off-the-cuff thoughts and what did you see in Abu Dhabi during MC13?
Thank you very much, Victor. First of all, it's a great pleasure and honor to join you this morning for the Friends of Multilateralism on this important subject. Victor was the person who was head of the Council Division, which is the senior-most position really within the Secretariat, advising Director General after Director General on how to make the place run. So there couldn't be any better person to work with me this morning to discuss WTO reform and where it's needed. It's the perfect time to be discussing WTO reform. This was to be the reform ministerial conference, the beginning of reform, and it wasn't. It did. It was instructive. It held up a mirror to the WTO to show its deficiency. Where's the need for reform? You could see it in this ministerial. First, there was a potential to backslide, to have less governance of the world trading system, and that was fought back. That was successful. That was the singular success of this ministerial. They tried to address the dispute settlement system and its well-known deficiencies, the fact that the system that was devised in the Marrakesh Agreement isn't working at all. At the appellate level, has disappeared. The second area is the legislative function. Can they make rules? I mean, there are three functions of governance, it seems to me. One is to settle disputes, one is to make rules, and one is to administer the system. And the weakness of the WTO was on display throughout. They had one agreement that they had concluded that members wanted to see brought into the WTO acquis, the WTO set of agreements formally, and that was the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, and that was blocked. And the role of the executive, well, Ngozi Ikanjo-Iweala, the Director General, was not putting proposals on the table She was not setting the agenda. It's a so-called member-driven organization. She did not have a general counsel to advise her formally as to what was right, what was wrong, what was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable, what is consensus. So no executive either. And no reports on what was actually going on in the world. So what are the threats? Strategic foresight. In any event, the defects of the WTO as an organization were thoroughly on display. At least that was the subtext of the entire ministerial.
Thanks, Alan. A bit of a gloomy picture that you painted to us, but I guess you laid out pretty nicely as an introduction some issues that I would like to touch upon with you. Dispute settlement, the negotiating function, the question of new agreements, the issue of the governance of the organization itself, what you call the executive branch. So I propose that we take one by one of these issues, hoping that we have time to cover all of them. Alan, as you know, this term WTO reform means different things to different people, right? But I guess everyone would agree that reestablishing the dispute settlement mechanism is part of that reform. And to me, since it is part of reform, I guess it implies that this mechanism will not be in the future as it was before. Now, we know the reasons that led to the stalemate on the appointment of appellate body members. Now, and last year, there was this informal process that ended up producing a very comprehensive document with suggestions. I guess you've seen this document. What is your view about this document? Was it discussed in Abu Dhabi? And more importantly, could this perhaps be a first step in reestablishing a two-tiered dispute settlement mechanism?
Well, I wish I had better news to report. There is a positive side to this. Marco Molina, the former deputy permanent representative of Guatemala, did a good job in the last year pulling together ideas without attribution to being backed by any particular member, so-called interest-based negotiations, which I find a bit of a fiction, but a useful fiction, that no one's in favor of anything in particular, but somehow they all come together, and there are things that are at least gaining a consensus or close to it. And there's a lot of good work that's been done in cleanup, in making the system work more smoothly, if there is to be a binding dispute settlement system applicable to all, which is something that's a blank in Mr. Molina's group of collection of ideas, because there is no consensus on whether there's to be two levels with an appellate level, of whether it's to be binding, of whether everybody is to be in it. There's a very strange mandate for 2024. When I was in Abu Dhabi, I decided to look a little bit more closely at what's exactly the language of getting something in 2024. And it turns out the language talks about accessibility, not applicability, of a dispute settlement system. Well, it's accessible to all, but do they have to come in? So is there a binding dispute settlement? And there is no commitment to that even in the mandate for getting something done this year. So what do I see is to get from here to there? I'm not sure there'll ever be an appellate body. I don't know there's no indication the United States wants to see one recreated. It's not impossible, but it's not indicated. How do we get to a universal dispute settlement system? One is destroy the inherent systemic bias against trade remedies. That was the original U.S. issue. It's still there. It's not as prominent, but it's there. 165 pages or so filed by the U.S. of complaints about the appellate body, how it operated with respect to trade remedies. Secondly, the system cannot resolve political questions, in my view. So what is in a country's national interest? I don't think that can be second-guessed by three worthy experts picked off the street or diplomats to say, it was not in your particular interest to have a national security interest, essential interest to have that measure, but you have to pay a price. Somewhat like Article 28, rebalancing of concessions, you must pay a price. There's been no negotiation coming together on that. Thirdly, I believe in this era that the U.S. politically is not going to accept binding dispute settlement with China, and therefore there'll have to be an opt-out and they'll have to work out how they're going to settle their disputes if they can work it out. And then lastly, one has to deal with overreach. If you have a non-functioning legislative function in the WTO, no corrective, a dispute settlement body that has no particular view that it can express successfully with respect to how dispute settlement is operating. If you have no executive, you have a rule by judges. And that actually is something the French Revolution dealt with in a rather bloody way. Well, we have less bloodshed at the WTO, but nevertheless, we have a rule by judges called kritarchy. Molina had good suggestions, more reliance on good offices, conciliation, mediation, a less litigious approach to dispute settlement, ideas on how they would function, how panels would operate, how opinions should be concise and focused and only address those matters that are put before them, put before a panel by the members. But he doesn't have all the answers. It's a beginning. He has an advisory committee of a committee of the whole, 166 countries, to advise on whether there are problems with dispute settlement. Well, that's kicking it back to the entire membership without really hope that they'll be able to resolve it.
A lot to unpack in what you said, Alan, and I don't think we have the time for that today because we want to focus more broadly on other issues. But I find it particularly interesting, the amount of issues that you referred to in your reply that somehow have to do only with the problems of dispute settlement, surely from the US point of view, but restoring something that was there and got broken is indeed a very tall order. There's, I guess, three questions that we could ask. Is everybody in agreement that we should have an impartial mechanism? And I guess the reply to that question is yes, it should be impartial. Second question, is everybody in agreement that it should be mandatory? Well, I guess there's some question marks there, right? Since you just as you mentioned, maybe it doesn't apply to all types of relations. You mentioned China. And third, does everybody agree that it has to be a two-tiered system? And I guess there are many question marks there as well. Now, given the breadth and the length of the proposals that we have seen, I particularly and personally find it somewhat surprising that ministers instructed their officials in the decision on dispute settlement at Abu Dhabi to conclude this work in 2024. And you said it yourself, there is elections this year in the United States and other parts. How credible is that? Wouldn't it be more credible to say, give it another time or even leave it open? I don't know. What's your view on the timing of this, Alan?
Well, I agree with your observations. We're not on the path towards solution. There is no indication whatsoever. I mean, if there were real negotiations underway, one of the two of us, one of the Friends of Multilateralism group might have caught a little scent of the fact that there are really hard negotiations underway on the tough issues. It's not there. And why should the end of 2024, just because they say it'd be nice to have it by the end of 2024, why is that going to be magic? It is after two important elections in India and the United States, but is that sufficient in the last month of 2024 to suddenly pick up and solve all these problems? I don't think so. I see a precondition for getting to a solution as to stop the fraud of appeals into the void. It's been 5 years this year, will have been 5 years since the appellate body disappeared from the face of the earth. There's still pictures of appellate body members in one of the corridors of the WTO, but that's the existence of the appellate body. And someone can point to the Marrakesh Agreement and say, well, it mentions there is one there, but they've been accepting appeals to a body that doesn't exist and warehousing these cases. So there is no finality to judgments. So I'd say stop the fraud. Several members tried to do that at Abu Dhabi, and they failed, blocked by the United States and some others, presumably Russia, oddly enough, and others. We have no process at all. What's the process? So no formalized way of negotiating, at least in the time you and I were there at the WTO. David Walker, ambassador from New Zealand, respected member, former general counsel chair, was given the mandate to collect ideas and see where consensus should be reached on some issues. He didn't finish the job, but it was a start. So who's doing this? How quickly will they do it? There's no timeline. A realistic one has to be established, as you say. The objective has to be, in my view, clear that there will be binding dispute settlement again at the WTO, applicable to all. That was a hallmark of the WTO that was created in the Uruguay round, that you get, what does binding mean? You get a final answer. You may not live up to it. There may be retaliation. There may be compensation paid, but you do get a final answer. And the four major issues have to be addressed. Does precedent matter? Is it binding? Is national security something that a panelist will decide? Is there any opt-out, which we've discussed? And developing country accessibility. Do developing countries really have a way to, especially in a case against a large country, a way to get any form of justice in dispute settlement? So there's work to be done. It isn't on its way yet.
Thanks a lot, Alan. We could talk a lot about dispute settlement. I propose that we move to another part of WTO reform, which is important to many delegations, and you mentioned it in your introduction, which is negotiations and the move towards a more flexible type of decision-making, more flexible type of agreements. For example, agreements to which only a subset and maybe even a majority of WTO members are signatories. I guess this would alleviate the burden of consensus by all members, 166 now in WTO decision-making. And yet what we saw in Abu Dhabi, as you mentioned, is that the investment facilitation agreement, for example, could not be incorporated into the plurilateral agreements in Annex 4 of the Marrakesh Agreement because of an opposition by India and some others. Question is the WTO condemned to be forever hostage of the whims of one or two members? What is going to happen to these agreements if they cannot be incorporated into the WTO legal framework? I'm thinking specifically not only about the investment facilitation agreement, but hopefully in the future we will have an e-commerce agreement. Will they be just hanging out there? What's going to happen with this?
Well, I see this a central problem of the WTO is the inability to reach agreements, the inability to legislate. This is at least co-equal with dispute settlement. That has gotten the headlines. That's what every reporter writes about is, my God, dispute settlement has been blocked and it's not working. Well, agreements have been blocked and they're not working. And that's very important. So I think variable geometries have been explored so that the trade facilitation agreement was a step in that direction of you do what you can. You may be the most underdeveloped, least developed country on the planet, but you have a role. You're a member of the system. You can do something. You'll be helped to do it. So different geometries is a way forward. Consensus is been distorted to mean every country has a veto. Well, if you were on a train and every passenger has an emergency brake, the train wouldn't get very far. And that's where we are today. Singapore has the Singapore ambassador, Hung Seng Tan, has come forward with the idea of responsible consensus. It's a noble idea. I'm not sure it's enough. It's a start. I think actually one has to define when consensus is applicable, how it's to be applied in order to go forward. Critical mass. Some agreements you can have far less than all the members, and they're very effective and they're very useful. The investment facilitation for development agreement, which harmed nobody, which was benefits given to everybody, should never have been blocked. It shouldn't have been possible to block it, and it should have been housed at the WTO. The drift away from hard law I find distressing. I'm a lawyer. You're a lawyer. I think you don't have a suggestion as to whether you can cross against the light in a crosswalk. You have a law, and there's a good reason to have a law because it's plain to everyone that society functions better with the law. Let me give you an example. Is there anything about gender in the WTO that should be binding? What if you don't allow women to participate as consumers, as producers, as persons involved, as entrepreneurs, as persons involved in trade? Are you living up to your obligations at the WTO? Well, there might be a firm rule that said you keep women out of the possibility of participation in trade, and that would be at least a non-violation nullification and impairment case. In other words, it'd be actionable in some form or other. Now, we've gotten to soft law to the point where we're expressing feelings about trade, and that's useful in some instances, but actually you have to have some rules. So how do we get from here to there? I think there will have to be a display of power. It won't happen now. It won't happen from China, won't happen from the EU, won't happen from the US at present. But the way we got a WTO was to cancel the old GATT and bring in a new GATT as part of the Uruguay round and the WTO era. So change is going to have to come if we want an effective international organization.
Thanks, Alan. I agree with you. Change will have to happen. Now, you mentioned rules. Two of the most important subjects that were under negotiation and that have been mandated clearly from the past, namely agriculture and fishery subsidies, saw no progress at all with MC13, and I find that particularly worrying. Neither was there a reference in the Abu Dhabi Ministerial Declaration to important issues that, for example, we have been discussing in our group and with other interested friends on industrial policy, for example. What do you think are the implications of these failings to the WTO?
I think the WTO has to be relevant to remain respected. So there was we've all noticed that there was a pandemic globally. It interfered with world trade greatly. What was the response? It was a sort of a side issue of political importance to some people about modifying TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property agreement. Was there a rule that you'd share vaccines that was enforceable? Was there a rule that personal protective equipment, masks, and other goods that were essential for dealing with the pandemic? We missed an opportunity in the global trading system. We had one good General Council meeting where countries came in on a single subject and they talked about their problems, but they never got around to solutions. Now, as you say, industrial policy is a key issue. Climate change is going to affect food security. What are we doing about it? The rules in agriculture haven't changed during the WTO period, except in some small ways. Carbon border adjustment mechanisms, how will they be regulated? How will they be acceptable? These are key issues, and they'll come in as disputes, maybe at the end of this process, but they're not coming in as negotiating subjects, and they should. The impact of AI, what's it mean for world trade? It should be discussed. Our friend Hamid Mamdouh talks about restoring the deliberative process before you get to negotiations at the WTO, and we don't have a deliberative process. At the extreme, even geopolitical rivalry. Does the WTO have no role at all in the geopolitical rivalry when it affects trade to such a great extent? Is there a role for collective security? Can the countries of the WTO band together and say, whatever you're doing in this particular instance, a country, it's a difficulty cause for all of us, and we have a concern, and we want to be involved. If the Black Sea becomes impassable again for grain, if the Red Sea becomes impassable for anything, do we care as a trade organization? Well, we should be discussing these things and see what should be done from a trade perspective.
Yeah, it seems like the issues are piling up, and with the inability not only of having new agreements, but even to discuss them. This is really worrying. And to me, Alan, what you discuss in your book when you refer to an executive branch of the WTO could be one way, at least, to channel these discussions. If you had a executive branch or some sort of organism or board in the WTO that could sort of channel these concerns and these new issues, that would help, wouldn't it? Please talk to us a little bit more about your ideas. I mean, I've read your book, so I know what's in there. But for those who haven't read it, I find it fascinating. Although I have question marks myself about this executive branch, but where things are now, I'm more and more convinced of what you propose. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Well, at the OECD, the sister organizations, international economic organizations of the WTO, the OECD, the World Bank, the Fund, they have an executive. And you say, oh, well, they have different purposes and different functions, so it's not really appropriate for us. I don't see that. If you have any form of social organization, a club, an NGO, a think tank, a city, a town, you always have a government. You have an executive because why? You want to get some things done. And we say to Ngozi and her predecessors, oh, you don't get to make any proposals. That's not your role. Well, at the bank, the fund, the OECD, they do make proposals. Not only that, they chair the executive committee of the members who are resident, which I think should happen at the WTO. The knowledge of the Secretariat is very strong. but it has not the independence of the IMF will say, well, we need to have an examination of the following subject. We need to have proposals. We need a replenishment of our resources. The World Bank staff may say there needs to be a facility to deal with climate change or the like. If Ngozi, as Director General, came into the room and said, I have a proposal that we do the following to solve the following problem, people would say, who are you? You say, well, I'm the Director General. Well, what's it say in the Marrakesh Agreement as to the role of the Director General? Nothing. And even less, I mean, she's the head of the administrative functions. That's it. So she can promote people or fire them, perhaps. But solve any problems? Not, that's not her job, supposedly. Now, she's done a good job, and Azevedo did on occasion, to convene interested parties. So there was a convening function, and they let her do that and let him do that. But there was no constitutional convention to set up the WTO. It was an afterthought. The Uruguay round did not set out to have a World Trade Organization. It was a professor, John Jackson, advising the Canadian government, who told the European Union about it and said, well, that's a pretty good idea. The US was sort of cool about it. No one sat down and said, well, how's it going to operate? And how's dispute settlement really going to work? They focused on that to a degree because they wanted to curb US unilateralism. On executive branch, nothing. So what are the problems that are coming up? Strategic foresight. The EU has a vice president of the Commission who's in charge of strategic foresight. What's that mean? It means my group, see the following problems that are coming down the road that will affect us. And policy planning. Every government has policy planning. At least their military has some policy planning. And the WTO does not. A general counsel. There's a general counsel at the WTO who talks about addresses administrative matters. But what about, for example, is the consensus, the operation of consensus on agreements, was that mandated? Is that what consensus has to mean? Why can't Ngozi, as Director General, have at least private advice from somebody, a lawyer, who says, well, no, there are options, and maybe she could say something about it. So we're not going to sit down and have a constitutional convention, in part because the way the world is now, we'd come up with something far worse. Too many countries would say, what I need is not regulation and rules. I need policy space, which is a very, very nice anodyne term. It's very soothing to hear it. Policy space means no regulation. I can do whatever I want and be as destructive as I want to the interests of others. So while we're not going to stop and redesign the WTO incrementally, we have to be very careful that we're moving forward and changing the WTO to be fit for being an organization that meets the challenges of the 21st century. And we don't have that. We struggle to do it, but we do not have a concerted effort to do it. And that's what reform should be. That's where we should be today. Real reform to create a more effective institution. And we're not making sufficient progress, if any, in that direction.
Alan,
so I think that's my thought on that subject.
No, but I think it's great, and I think it's although it is worrying, you surely point to some ideas that could help make the WTO more fit for the challenges that we have before us. So this is surely a discussion to be continued, and I'm sure our group will continue this discussion, and hopefully, in not a too distant future, we can make some proposals to members and make some outreach activities to the WTO members and perhaps to the WTO Secretariat and Director General as well. For now, Alan, I would like to thank you very much for your participation, for your intelligence, for your insight, and wish all a good day and continuation. And surely this is a discussion that we will continue. Thanks a lot, Alan.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of faith in the benefits of international cooperation, and in trade, the way to go forward is through the WTO, and the Friends of Multilateralism will be very supportive of that effort. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you. Thank you.